The moment Marina Holloway stepped forward in that vast obsidian chamber, the entire vampire court fell silent, not the polite silence of ceremony, not the reverent hush of royal proceedings. This was the silence of shock, of disbelief so profound it had stolen every word from every immortal throat in the room. 300 vampires, some of them older than nations, stared at her as though she had just pulled a star from the sky and held it in her bare human hands. She did not step back. Marina stood at the center of the court of Corvinus, beneath a ceiling carved with the histories of 1,000 years of blood law, her brown hair loose around her shoulders, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain every creature in this room could hear it. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, so no one would see. At the front of the chamber, upon the high obsidian throne carved from volcanic glass and ancient bone, sat Gideon Corvinus, sovereign of the blood courts, ruler of this hidden realm beneath the city of Vienna, her silver-white hair coiled like a crown, her pale eyes cutting as broken ice. Beside her stood her advisors, ancient vampires whose names had appeared in history books under different identities for centuries. And chained at the base of the dais on his knees, wrists locked in iron that glowed with old runes, was Gideon Corvinus, the heir. Marina had spent 6 months teaching him European literature at the private Harrow Academy, the school that served both human students from wealthy families and the carefully disguised children of vampire nobility. She had spent 6 months being amused by his sharp, sardonic wit, challenged by his impossible memory, unsettled by his pale grey eyes that seemed to hold entire centuries behind them. She had spent 6 months being gradually, helplessly drawn towards someone she had told herself, repeatedly and firmly, was absolutely off limits. She had not spent 6 months watching him survive brutal tutors and ancient expectations, only to watch him be condemned for a crime he did not commit. So when the High Arbiter of the court, a creature named Valdris Morn, had finished reading the charges against Gideon, and when the sovereign had lifted one pale hand and said, "The sentence is exile beyond the veil, where no blood will sustain him until he perishes," Marina had done the thing that no mortal had ever done inside these walls. She had stood up and said, clearly and loudly, into the perfect silence of immortal judgment, "I object." Now, in the ringing aftermath of those 2 words, she felt the full weight of 300 immortal stares pressing against her skin like cold hands. Gideon's head had snapped up from where it hung between his shoulders. His silver-white hair, loose and disheveled, fell across his face, and through the curtain of it, those pale grey eyes found her with an expression that shattered something in her chest. It was not relief. It was not even surprise. It was raw terror, but not for himself. He was terrified for her. "You should not have done that," he said, and his voice, even now, even chained and kneeling, carried that quiet authority she had always found so deeply, inexplicably compelling. "Noted," Marina said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I object anyway." Gideon Corvinus rose slowly from her throne. Every vampire in the room went absolutely still in the way that only truly ancient things went still, like mountains that had decided to become predators. She was tall, devastatingly beautiful in the way of something carved by time and ruthlessness into pure form, and she regarded Marina the way a storm regards a candle. "Mortal," she said, and the single word contained 1,000 years of absolute authority. "Are you aware that the last creature who interrupted a sentence of the Blood Court was dismembered before they could draw a second breath?" Marina swallowed. "I am now. Are you aware that no mortal has ever been granted the right of objection under blood law, then it is time to change that, Marina said, and she hated how much her voice wanted to tremble and how firmly she refused to let it. Because what you are about to do is wrong, and the law you are using to do it is being misapplied deliberately, and I can prove it. That last part landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it spreading outward through the assembled court in a murmur that was quickly silenced by a single glance from the sovereign. The pale eyes returned to Marina. Something moved in them that was not quite warmth, but was not entirely the promise of death either. You have 30 seconds to justify why I should not have you removed, Ragnar said. Marina reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and pulled out a folded document. She had carried it there for 2 days, ever since she had found it hidden inside the cover of a book that had been left on her desk at Harrow Academy. The book had been a first edition of Keats, annotated in Gideon's handwriting. She had thought it was a gift. It had taken her a full day to find the document sewn into the spine. Blood Law, Article 93, the doctrine of witnessed intent, she said, unfolding it, which states that no heir of a sovereign house may be sentenced for an act of unauthorized territorial aggression if a verified, non-conflicted witness can provide testimony that the action was taken in direct response to a prior attack on that heir's life. She looked up from the paper. I was there. I saw what happened in the Harrow corridor 3 weeks ago. Gideon did not initiate the confrontation with Lord Valdres Morn's son. He was defending himself, and he was defending me. The murmur in the court rose sharply this time, and Valdres Morn, standing to the right of the throne, in his robes of deep violet, his ancient face gone perfectly rigid, did not move a muscle. Gideon, at the base of the dais, had closed his eyes. Rhaenyra looked from Marina to Valdres Morn, and then back, and her expression was unreadable as carved marble. The 30 seconds elapsed. She did not have Marina removed. Instead, she sat back down on her throne, folded her pale hands in her lap, and said, in a voice like cold silk, "Then you will speak, mortal teacher, and what you say will be weighed under blood law as if you were one of us." Do you understand what that means? It means that if I lie, the penalty is the same as it would be for a vampire, Marina said. I understand it means, Ragnar corrected softly, that if you lie, the penalty applied to you will be worse, because the courage it takes for a mortal to stand in this court is precisely the kind of courage that blood law does not tolerate being wasted on falsehood. Her eyes held Marina's. Are you still willing to speak? Marina looked past the sovereign, past the assembled court, down at Gideon, still kneeling in those rune-burned chains, and found him already looking back at her with an expression that was quietly, devastatingly undone, as though something in him had broken open in the best possible way. Yes, she said, I am willing. 6 months earlier, Marina had taken the position at Harrow Academy because she had needed a challenge, and because the salary was extraordinary, and because she had been told only that the school served an unusual student body that required discretion and a certain willingness to adapt. She had assumed this meant wealthy eccentrics, or perhaps students with exceptional academic needs. She had not assumed vampires. She found out on the 3rd day, when a boy in the back row of her advanced European literature class had looked up from his copy of Dracula with a deeply unimpressed expression and said, "The author met my uncle once." This characterization is, to put it charitably, theatrical. Marina had looked at the white-skinned, silver-haired young man with the pale grey eyes and the aristocratic cheekbones. Sitting in the seat farthest from the window, on a bright autumn morning, and something in her brain had assembled the relevant information very, very quietly and efficiently, and then presented her with a conclusion she had not been expecting. She had set her copy of the book down. "Is the basic premise accurate, at least?" she had asked. Gideon Corvinus had tilted his head slightly. "The aversion to sunlight is somewhat overstated. We are not obliterated. We are merely uncomfortable and weakened. The blood dependency is accurate. The counting of grains is not, and I do not turn into a bat." He had paused. "My grandfather does." It skipped a generation. Marina had stared at him for a long moment. Then she had opened her gradebook, written something in it, and said to the class, "I expect written proof that you have each engaged critically with the primary text. Mr. Corvinus, your annotation of this chapter was excellent. I would like a full essay by Friday on the difference between cultural mythology and lived reality. The rest of you, primary source analysis of at least 3 texts." The class had watched her with varying degrees of astonishment. Gideon had watched her with something different, a slow, considering look, as though she had passed some kind of test he had not announced. It had started there. It had grown in pieces over months in the particular way that complicated things grow between people who are both intelligent enough to recognize what is happening and stubborn enough to resist naming it. Marina assigned him harder texts because he consumed easy ones the way other people consumed air effortlessly and without satisfaction. He started leaving first editions on her desk, annotated in his handwriting, the margins filled with observations so sharp and original they sometimes left her quietly awed. She argued with him about interpretation in class because he was often brilliant and occasionally infuriating, and she refused to simply agree with him when she thought he was wrong. He seemed to find this genuinely delightful, which she found both encouraging and inconvenient. There were rules at Harrow Academy. Rules about professional distance. Rules about the fundamental impossibility of certain kinds of relationships across the human-vampire divide. Rules that Marina understood and respected in the abstract and found increasingly difficult to maintain in practice when Gideon stayed after class to debate Camus and ended up sitting across from her desk for 3 hours while the Vienna autumn darkened beyond the arched windows, and she forgot to be aware of anything except the way he argued, all intensity and careful logic, and the occasional flash of something that looked very much like genuine delight. When she found a counterpoint he had not anticipated, he had never treated her as lesser. That was perhaps the thing she had not expected, from someone born to an ancient house of vampire nobility, someone who had spent 2 centuries existing in a world where mortals were peripheral. He disagreed with her the way an equal disagrees with an equal, with full attention and real engagement, and not even a trace of condescension. He asked for her opinion as though it genuinely mattered to him, and when she gave it, he listened in a way that most people never listened, with his whole attention concentrated on her, as though she were the only interesting thing in the room, which was, of course, an enormous problem. The incident in the Harrow corridor had occurred on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, 3 weeks before the court session that would nearly end everything. Marina had been walking back from the library toward her classroom, her arms full of 19th century poetry collections, when she had heard raised voices from around the corner of the north corridor. She had recognized Gideon's voice immediately. The other voice she did not recognize. She had turned the corner and found Gideon standing between her and a tall, pale vampire she had not seen before. Someone who was not a student, someone older, his white hair pulled back sharply, his dark clothing of a style that looked older than the building around him. He had been holding a blade, the kind of blade, Marina would later learn, that was specific to the vampire court, a rune-etched weapon capable of severing the kind of immortal threads that normal steel could not touch. Gideon had not been holding a weapon. He had been holding nothing, his hands at his sides, his pale eyes locked on the stranger, with an expression of controlled fury. "You have entered a protected academic's space without authorization," Gideon had said, very quietly, "which means that whatever you are carrying from whoever sent you is already inadmissible under blood law, which means you have come here to do something blood law cannot sanction, which means," he had continued, still in that same quiet, controlled voice, "that you are about to make a very significant mistake." The stranger had smiled, and it had been the kind of smile that had nothing behind it, and had raised the blade. Marina had done what any reasonable person does when they watch someone raise a blade towards someone else. She had thrown the largest of the poetry collections directly at the stranger's head, which was not particularly effective as a weapon, but was effective as a distraction, and in the half-second it created, Gideon had moved. He moved the way vampires move when they stop pretending to be limited by human speed, which is to say he moved in a way that the human eye could not entirely follow, a blur of controlled force, and the stranger found himself against the corridor wall, with Gideon's hand at his throat and the blade somewhere on the floor several meters away. "Go back to whoever sent you," Gideon had said, still quiet, still controlled, "and tell them that this ground is protected, and tell them that if they send someone near her again, the consequences will be mine to deliver personally, and I will not be gentle about it." The stranger had left. Gideon had turned, and for a moment the mask of control had slipped entirely, and he had crossed the corridor in 3 steps and taken Marina's face in both his cool hands and looked at her with an intensity that had stopped her breath completely. "Are you hurt?" he had asked. "I am not," she had managed. He had exhaled slowly, and the relief that moved through his expression was so complete and unguarded that she had felt it like something physical, like warmth, though his hands were cool and his eyes held 2 centuries of hard-earned composure now quickly reassembling itself. He had held her face for 1 more second longer than was strictly necessary, and then stepped back, and the distance between them had become something charged and deliberate. "You threw a book," he said. "It was the largest one I had." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Which one?" She had looked down at where it had landed, spine-cracked, pages splayed. "Tennyson, complete works." The almost smile had become briefly, genuinely real. "An appropriate weapon," he had said. Tennyson would have approved. She had looked at him, this ancient, white-haired, dangerous, complicated creature who had just placed his body between her and a rune-blade without hesitation, who was now standing in a corridor, looking at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing in ways that she suspected he was not accustomed to failing. She had thought, clearly, and without much hope of talking herself out of it, that she was very deeply in trouble. What she had not known was that the stranger was Cassiveth Morn, second son of High Arbiter Valdris Morn, and that the confrontation had been witnessed by 2 members of the Corvinus court, who had reported it upward with significant political embellishment, and that Valdris Morn, who had his own reasons to want the Corvinus heir removed from his current path, had spent the following 3 weeks constructing a case of unauthorized territorial aggression that would lead to the sentence of exile beyond the veil. She had not known any of this until she found the document in the spine of the Keats book, along with a note in Gideon's handwriting. So spare it broke her heart with its brevity. "Do not come to the court. It is not safe for you. I have made arrangements. This is not goodbye, it is a postponement." And then below that, in smaller letters, as though he had almost not written it at all, "You were always the most remarkable person in any room you entered." I am sorry I never said so more plainly. She had read that note 4 times. Then she had put on her coat and gone to find the entrance to the Blood Court of Corvinus beneath the city of Vienna. Now she stood in that court and told them what she had seen. She was precise. She had a teacher's habit of clarity and a natural instinct for the difference between relevant and irrelevant detail, and she presented what had happened in the Harrow corridor with the same careful structure she used to lead a class through a difficult text. Each piece placed deliberately, nothing overstated. Cassiveth Morn had entered a protected academic space. He had carried a sanctioned court weapon without authorization in a civilian setting. He had raised that weapon first. Gideon had responded only after that weapon was raised, and he had done so without drawing his own, using physical restraint rather than lethal force. She watched the court as she spoke. She watched Valdris Morn's ancient face go through several expressions that his composure quickly sealed over, none of them pleasant. She watched the sovereign's face remain unreadable as cut stone, but her pale eyes never left Marina's face. And there was something in them that was not the cold threat it had been when Marina first stood up. It was something more complicated. When she finished, the chamber was silent for a long moment. "These are serious claims," the sovereign said. "They implicate the High Arbiter's household in an unauthorized attack on the heir of this court. Are you willing to swear this testimony under the ancient binding?" Marina had not known what the ancient binding was. She had learned it in the past 20 minutes from a vampire near the back of the chamber who had evidently decided Marina deserved to know what she was walking into, and had murmured the information to her in a voice too low for most humans to hear. The ancient binding was a truth covenant, blood-sealed, that made it physically impossible to lie for a period of 72 hours after taking it, and that inflicted significant pain on any attempt to do so. It also, the vampire had told her quietly, required the person taking it to a drop of blood, which, in this court, meant offering something of yourself to creatures who could smell it from across the room, which was the kind of vulnerability that required a significant amount of nerve. "Yes," Marina said, "I am willing." Gideon's voice came from the dais, sharp and immediate. "She is not sworn to this court. You cannot compel a mortal to take the binding without her full consent and understanding of all consequences." "She has given consent," the sovereign said, looking at her son. "She gave consent without knowing that the binding temporarily marks her blood as court claimed, which means she will carry a court signature for 72 hours that will make her visible to every vampire court in Europe." His voice was still controlled, but his eyes were not, and Marina could hear, beneath the precision, a raw edge that had nothing to do with legal argument. If she does this, she is walking into a political situation she was not born into and does not deserve to be trapped by. "The blood law does not discriminate by birth," the sovereign said. "It should in this case." His pale eyes moved from his mother to Marina, and the argument he was not making with words was written in every line of his face, in the ferocity of his controlled stillness, in the way he was watching her. "Do not do this," those eyes said. You have already done enough. You have already done more than I deserved. Please, do not put yourself further at risk for me." Marina held his gaze for one long, still moment. She thought about the corridor. She thought about Tennyson. She thought about the note in the spine of the Keats book, and the words she intended to say to him as soon as he was out of those chains, about the things he should have said more plainly, because she had some things of her own that she had been insufficiently plain about. She looked back at the sovereign. "I understand the full consequence," she said. "I will take the binding." The binding was performed at the center of the court floor, where she was already standing. A court elder, a small ancient vampire with white hair wound in elaborate braids, came forward with a silver instrument and a crystalline vial. The cut was shallow, a thin line across Marina's palm that stung sharply, and the drop of blood that fell into the vial seemed to carry the entire attention of every creature in the room. She felt the moment the binding took effect, a sensation like cold water poured through her chest, clarifying and bracing and slightly terrifying. Then they asked her again under the binding. She told them everything. The same story. Each detail exactly as she had told it, and under the binding it was impossible to trim or soften or adjust, and the clarity of it was complete. The cut on her palm did not hurt more than before. She had not been lying. When she finished for the second time, the chamber was quiet in a different way, not shocked quiet. Considering quiet, Valdris Morn spoke first, from his position to the right of the throne, his ancient voice perfectly modulated and entirely without warmth. The testimony of a mortal, even under binding, is not equivalent to court witness testimony under blood law. The statute requires a witness who is party to the covenant of the blood. This testimony, however earnest, cannot be considered legally sufficient to overturn a court sentence. The sovereign had not moved, but something about her stillness changed quality. She said, very carefully, "Article 93 does not specify that the witness must be a party to the blood covenant. It specifies that the witness must be non-conflicted. Cite me the clause, Arbiter Morn, that restricts this to court members." A very long silence. "It is implied by precedent," Valdris Morn said. "Precedent," said a new voice from the left side of the chamber, "is not statute." A tall vampire in dark silver robes stepped forward, white-haired and aristocratic, his ancient face carrying the particular calm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Marina did not know him. She would later learn he was Arcaneth Vasile, head of the oldest neutral house in the European courts, a figure of enormous influence and consistent political neutrality, the kind of vampire whose opinions moved courts like tides moved coastlines. The mortal teacher has taken the binding. Her testimony is clean. Article 93 contains no citizenship restriction. I have read that article no fewer than 400 times in my life, Valdris, and I would remember if it did. The tension in the room shifted with a physical weight. Valdris Morn's expression had become a precise blank, the kind that covered a great deal of activity beneath it. The binding does not retroactively legitimate a mortal's right to object in these proceedings. She already objected, Arcaneth Vasile said, with the mildest possible tone that somehow carried absolute finality. And she was not removed, and she was not silenced, and the sovereign herself permitted her to speak, which by the precedent you invoked constitutes court recognition of her standing. You cannot invoke precedent to restrict her, and simultaneously deny that the precedent of her being heard establishes her right to be heard. He turned to the sovereign. The logic does not hold. Regnara, The sovereign looked at Valdris Morn for a long moment. Then she turned to the court at large, and her voice carried to every corner of that vast obsidian chamber without effort, the voice of someone who had ruled for a very long time and intended to rule for a great deal longer. The Blood Court of Corvinus finds the witness testimony of Marina Holloway, given under ancient binding, and verified clean, sufficient to invoke the witnessed intent doctrine under Article 93. The charges of unauthorized territorial aggression against the heir, Gideon Corvinus, are dismissed. She paused. Furthermore, the court finds sufficient grounds to investigate whether the Morn household initiated an unauthorized armed incursion into protected academic space, which itself violates blood law at the highest level. Arbiter Morn, your blade, her eyes moved to him. You will not be needing it during the investigation period. Valdris Morn was removed from his position that night. The details of his investigation would unfold over weeks, revealing a network of political maneuvering that had been in motion for 2 years. An attempt to remove the Corvinus heir and elevate a Morn-aligned candidate to a position of influence over the succession. It was the kind of long-game court betrayal that apparently happened in vampire politics with some regularity, and Marina would spend considerable time afterward being deeply grateful that human politics, while often terrible, did not typically involve rune-blades in school corridors. But that was later. In the moment, the ruling had barely finished echoing before Gideon was on his feet, the rune chains dissolving with the court order, his silver-white hair loose around his shoulders, crossing the chamber floor in the particular controlled urgency of someone who is moving quickly while trying to look like they are not moving urgently at all. He stopped in front of Marina. He was taller than she always remembered, and paler in this chamber than in any classroom, the court lighting making him look like something carved from moonstone, which was, she thought with a slightly unhinged corner of her mind, extremely unfair. His pale grey eyes were fixed on her face, with an intensity that had no diplomatic veneer over it at all. "Your hand," he said. "It is fine," she said. Marina, just her name, and the way he said it, very quietly, with something in it that was not authority but was its own kind of command. She opened her palm. The cut was thin and shallow and had mostly stopped bleeding, and he looked at it for a long moment, and then, without taking his eyes from it, took her hand very gently in both of his cool ones. "You came," he said. "You left me a note," she said. "It was not particularly discouraging. It said not to come. It said goodbye. I told you in the 4th week of the semester that Hemingway's iceberg theory applies to human communication as much as prose. The significant thing is what is left unsaid." A pause. "I did not expect you to apply that to my handwriting. You annotated Keats in a way that suggested you had very strong feelings about beauty being woven into transient things," she said. "And then you left that annotation for me specifically and hid a legal document in the binding. I am a literature teacher. Subtext is my professional specialty." Something shifted in his expression, complex and layered and slow, like ice at the beginning of spring, and she thought she saw the exact moment he stopped attempting to be anything other than what he was with her. "You stood in front of the Blood Court," he said. "You stood in front of 300 vampires, and my mother, and you objected under blood law." "Under blood law," she confirmed. "No mortal has ever done that." I noticed the surprised reaction. "Yes, Marina." He said her name again, and it was different this time, quieter, with something underneath it that was not quite composed. That was in fact rather significantly unraveled. "Do you understand what it cost you?" The binding marks your blood for 72 hours. You are visible now to courts across Europe. There will be political implications. There will be questions about why a mortal teacher took the binding for the Corvinus heir. There will be factions who interpret this as an alliance of some kind, which will draw attention to you that I cannot entirely control, and that is not safe, and that— Gideon, she said, and his extraordinary, relentless cataloguing voice stopped. She looked up at him, his cool hand still holding hers, his pale eyes holding everything he was trying to structure into warnings. I know. I understood all of that before I spoke. Then why, he said. And it was not a demand, it was something completely genuine, something that had been stripped of every court-learned layer. Because you were going to be exiled, she said simply. Beyond the veil where nothing could sustain you. Because Valdrimorn manufactured the charges, and you knew it, and you had that document, and you left it for me anyway. Which means some part of you knew I would use it, and trusted me to use it, and because— She stopped, started again. Because you stood between me and a rune-blade without hesitating, you put yourself in front of something designed to end you specifically. And you did not hesitate for half a second, and then afterward you held my face in your hands and asked if I was hurt before you asked anything else. And I have been thinking about that for 3 weeks. I have been thinking about very little else. The chamber around them had largely emptied in the way that courts discreetly empty when something is clearly occurring between the sovereign's heir and a mortal woman that requires a certain degree of privacy. Arcaneth Vasile had departed with a very small, satisfied expression. The sovereign herself remained on her throne, but at a distance, and was very deliberately looking at something in the middle distance that was not them. Gideon's hands tightened slightly on hers. I have been thinking about considerably more than 3 weeks, he said, and his voice was very quiet now, stripped down to something honest. I have been thinking about the 4th day of the semester when you assigned me that essay, and did not flinch. I have been thinking about the argument we had about Dostoevsky that lasted 4 hours and ended with you being entirely correct and me being entirely unwilling to admit it until the following Tuesday. I have been thinking about the fact that you are the only person in 200 years of my life who has argued with me as a genuine equal, and meant it, and not been afraid of me, and not wanted anything from me. That was not simply the honest exchange of 2 minds encountering each other. He paused. That is extraordinarily rare. You are extraordinarily rare. Marina was quiet for a moment, aware of the weight of 2 centuries behind that word, rare, and what it meant from someone who had had that much time to observe and compare. I need to say something to you, she said. You may say anything to me, he said, and she believed him completely. You wrote in that note that it was not goodbye, it was a postponement, she said. I want you to know that I would not have accepted the goodbye either, just for future reference. His expression did something that was not quite a smile, but was made of the same material, warm and complicated, and directed entirely at her. Noted, he said. And you wrote, she continued, that I was the most remarkable person in any room I entered, and that you were sorry you had never said it more plainly. I stand by that assessment, he said. Then I will be equally plain, she said, for what it is worth, and I recognize it is complicated worth, given the difference in what we are and how long we have each existed, but for what it is worth. I have found you to be someone I would choose, if choosing were uncomplicated, which it is not, but which does not actually change the fact of the choice. The quiet that followed was the kind of quiet that has shape and weight. the kind that is full of something being recognized by both people simultaneously. Choosing is not uncomplicated, he said. You are mortal, I am not. The political implications of what happened in that court tonight are going to require significant management. My mother will have opinions. Factions will interpret this as an alliance, and they will not be entirely wrong, and the nature of that alliance will draw scrutiny. I know, she said. And despite all of that, he said, I find that I am completely unable to make a convincing case for the value of distance, which is itself an experience I have not had in a very long time. Then stop trying to make it, she said. He looked at her, and the 2 centuries of composure and court-learned restraint were still there, but underneath them, visible now in a way she suspected he permitted rather than lost control of, was something immense and careful and completely genuine. He brought her uncut hand up very slowly and pressed his lips to the back of it, cool and deliberate, and the touch moved through her like something fundamental shifting into place. Marina Holloway, he said against her knuckles, who throws Tennyson at armed vampire aristocrats and walks into sovereign courts without invitation and takes ancient bindings for the sake of a person she was told not to come for. Will you permit me to be significantly less restrained about this than I have been for 6 months? I will, she said, with considerable enthusiasm. He looked up at her, and that was, she thought, the most genuine expression she had ever seen on his face, open and warm and faintly, beautifully undone. Behind them, from the direction of the obsidian throne, the sovereign of the Blood Courts of Corvinus made a sound that was not precisely a cough, but served a similar diplomatic function, indicating the presence of a parent who had been politely not watching, and wished to register that her patience had a limit. Gideon straightened. His composure returned to its surface, but it was a different quality of composure now, less armored, as though something had been released from behind it. He kept Marina's hand in his. They turned to face the sovereign together. Regnara, Corvinus regarded them both from her throne, with the expression of someone who has lived long enough to recognize an immovable thing when she sees it. Her pale eyes moved between them with a calculating precision that Marina was beginning to find slightly familiar, in the way one finds a family resemblance familiar. The court has been cleared, the sovereign observed. It is unusual for the aftermath of a dismissal of charges to conclude in this particular way. I would say unprecedented, Gideon said. But the entire evening has been unprecedented. I believe Miss Holloway is largely responsible. Mrs. Holloway, Marina corrected automatically, then caught herself. Mrs. Holloway, sorry. Force of habit, I correct pronoun forms constantly. A pause from the sovereign. You correct grammar in my court, only my own, Marina said. I apologize. Something moved in the sovereign's pale face that was extraordinarily close to amusement. She said nothing for a long moment, looking at Marina with that unreadable attention. You used Article 93, she said finally. Yes, Marina said. Very few practitioners of blood law know that article well enough to cite it from memory in a high-pressure situation. The pale eyes were assessing. How did you find the document? Gideon hid it in a first-edition Keats, Marina said. He hid a legal document in a poetry book. He annotated the Keats very thoroughly first, Marina said, so it was not an unreasonable place to look. Another long pause. The sovereign's eyes moved to her son. You planned for this? Gideon was quiet for a moment. I planned for the possibility, he said. I did not believe she would come. I told her not to. And yet you provided the means. I provided the means, he agreed. and did not elaborate on what that meant about hope and what it means to leave a door open while telling someone not to walk through it. The sovereign looked between them for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly, lost some of the formal cadence of court speech, and become something more personal, still regal, but with the undercurrent of something very old and possibly tired. "The political consequences of what happened tonight are significant," she said. "The Morn investigation will require delicacy. The fact that a mortal woman's testimony under binding cleared my heir will be discussed in every court in Europe within a week. The nature of your involvement, Miss Holloway, will be scrutinized, I understand," Marina said. "What you may not understand," the sovereign continued, "is that the scrutiny will not only be political. There are factions who will view immortals with this level of access to court proceedings, and this level of willingness to act within them, as either an asset to be acquired or a liability to be removed." The pale eyes were direct and not unkind. "You have made yourself visible in a world that is often dangerous to visible mortals." The weight of this settled on Marina's shoulders with the quiet solidity of a real consequence. She felt Gideon's hand tighten on hers. "She will be protected," he said, "and it was not a request." "That is not your determination alone to make," the sovereign said. "Then it is mine to make," Marina said, before she could think too carefully about whether this was wise. Both Corvinus looked at her. "I am aware of what I walked into tonight. I was aware before I came. I can make an informed decision about my own risk tolerance." She met the sovereign's eyes. "I would also say, with respect, that the easiest way to reduce the danger of my visibility is to make it clear, through whatever official channels exist in court politics, that I am not a vulnerability. That I am instead, as you said, someone who took the ancient binding and was found truthful, who acted within blood law, who demonstrated both knowledge and willingness to work within your legal framework. That is not the profile of someone who can be easily leveraged. It is the profile of someone who would be more trouble than they are worth to target." A silence. Arkaneth Vasil, who had apparently not left the chamber entirely, but had been standing in the shadows near the far archway, made a small sound that in a human being would have been a quiet, approving laugh. The sovereign looked at Marina for a very long time. Then she said, "My son chose his teacher well. I assigned myself," Marina said. "He had no input. Then fortune chose well." The sovereign amended, and there was something in it that was not warmth exactly, but was its own kind of recognition. The weeks that followed were complicated in the way that things are complicated when an ancient political structure is being reorganized, and simultaneously a relationship is beginning between two people who have both been trying not to begin it for 6 months. There was a great deal happening at once, and Marina was required to be present for more of it than she had anticipated, because she had been right about her profile. A mortal who could navigate blood law was not easily dismissed, and the sovereign found uses for that skill that were not entirely unwelcome, in the way that being genuinely useful is never entirely unwelcome, even when it is also occasionally terrifying. The Morn investigation proceeded through formal channels. Cassiveth Morn, whose testimony under binding revealed considerably more than just the corridor incident, was stripped of his court standing. Valdry Morn, after a formal proceeding that Marina sat in on at the sovereign's request, was exiled to the mortal world without court protection or resources, which was apparently the vampire equivalent of a fairly severe sanction without crossing into anything terminal. Marina thought That was probably the right outcome. She wrote her observation of the proceedings in a document that was added to court records, which made her, as near as she could determine, the first mortal to have a formal documentary contribution to the Blood Court of Corvinus in its 900-year history. She found this extremely interesting. Gideon found it equal parts gratifying and quietly alarming. He was, she discovered over those weeks, an extraordinarily attentive presence when he had made up his mind to be one. He appeared at the end of her classes with the particular ease of someone who has decided not to pretend they are not there. He brought her things, coffee, because she was human and apparently needed it with a regularity he found both puzzling and endearing. Books she had not asked for, but that he had concluded she would want based on the threads of their conversations. Information about the court proceedings she was navigating, delivered with the precision and clarity of someone who understood that keeping her informed was the same as keeping her safe. He did not hover. He did not treat her as something fragile. He treated her as someone navigating a complex and dangerous situation with more competence than most people born into it, managed, which was his honest assessment, and she knew it because he told her, directly and without sentimentality, and then argued with her about Faulkner for 40 minutes immediately afterward, as though the compliment were simply a fact noted in passing. She learned things about him slowly in pieces, because he gave them that way, not from reticence, but because he had the restraint of someone who had existed long enough to know that the worthwhile things take time. She learned that he read with the voracious, inexhaustible appetite of someone for whom time does not limit the possible volume of intake, and that the books he loved most were always the ones that dealt honestly with mortality and time and the weight of living through change. She understood why, and the understanding moved through her with a particular tenderness. She learned that he had been 17 when he was turned, which meant he carried 17 years of human feeling, compressed under 200 years of immortal experience, and that this combination produced something that was neither the carelessness of pure immortality nor the immediacy of pure mortality, but something rarer and more complex. She learned that he had been quiet and bookish as a human boy in a court family that valued neither quietness nor books, and that the 2 centuries since had vindicated both qualities thoroughly, and that this had given him a certain dry satisfaction that she found deeply relatable. She learned that he slept during the late morning hours when sunlight was strongest, and that his discomfort in direct sun was real, though not as dramatic as mythology suggested. More a profound fatigue and sensitivity than an immediate danger, and that the north-facing classroom at Harrow Academy had not been an accident, but a specific request. She learned that he had read her academic publications before she arrived, which should have felt invasive, and instead felt irrationally like being known. He learned things about her too. She could feel him learning them with the particular attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. He learned that she argued hardest about the things she cared most about, which meant the ferocity of their debates was a map of her values, and he treated that map carefully. He learned that she had come to Vienna from a teaching position in Edinburgh because she had wanted something different and uncertain, because she was the kind of person who needed challenge the way other people needed stability. He learned that she was braver than she believed herself to be, and he told her so, not as flattery but as observation, in the same tone he used when he corrected a factual misapprehension. She was in the Harrow Academy library 3 weeks after the court session, grading papers in the evening, quiet when he appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who has something they have been composing. She accepted the coffee. She waited. He sat across from her, the way he had sat across from her all semester in her classroom after hours. And for a moment there was the particular companionable quiet that had become its own kind of intimacy between them. "There are some things I have been insufficiently direct about," he said. "I recall a note that said something similar," she said. "The note was also insufficiently direct," he said, and a ghost of his almost smile moved at his mouth. "I want to be direct now." He set down his coffee and looked at her across the table with that quality of attention that still had the power to make her feel like the only significant thing in the room. "I am not uncomplicated. The world I belong to is not safe, and last month demonstrated this in a way that I would rather had not required your personal participation in its danger. I am 200 years old, and you are 28, and that gap will only grow. And I will not insult your intelligence by pretending it is not a real consideration. There are aspects of what I am that require choices and accommodations that I cannot make for you. All of that is true." "It is," she said. "And I am aware," he continued, "that the practical and political realities of what my household is make a connection like this one structurally unusual, and that there will be court opinions about it, and that some of those opinions will be hostile." "Also true," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precision and care of someone saying an important thing only once, he said, "I love you, Marina. I have been aware of it for some time, and aware that acknowledging it created obligations I was not certain you wanted. I am acknowledging it now, because the alternative is continuing a silence that is itself a form of dishonesty. And you have demonstrated that you prefer honesty even when it is complicated." The library was quiet around them, the autumn city muffled beyond the arched windows, the lamplight warm on his pale, serious face. Marina set her pen down. "I love you too," she said, with the same directness. "I have been aware of it for considerably longer than I was comfortable admitting. I am also aware of all the complicated things you listed, and I consider them real and worth navigating, and I have no interest in pretending they do not exist, and I also have no interest in treating them as reasons to choose distance over something genuine." She met his eyes. "I choose genuine. I have been choosing it since that corridor, I think, and possibly since the first week of semester when you told me your grandfather turns into a bat, but I am allowing for the possibility that I was rationalizing prior to the corridor." He looked at her, and there it was again, that expression that was not armored at all, that was open and warm and present in a way that must cost someone with 2 centuries of careful self-possession something significant to allow. He moved from his side of the table to hers with the quiet deliberateness that was characteristic of how he did everything that mattered. And when he reached her, he did not rush. He tilted her face up with one cool hand under her jaw and looked at her for one moment, close and unhurried, as though this was something he intended to do slowly and with full attention. Then he kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that has patience in it, the kind that belongs to someone who has been waiting and knows the worth of what they were waiting for. And Marina thought with the part of her mind that was still capable of thought that this was the most natural, inevitable thing that had ever happened to her. When they separated, his forehead rested against hers, and his eyes were closed, and the usual composure was entirely absent from his face, replaced by something uncalculating and quietly luminous. That was also something I should have done more plainly, he said. Some time ago, she agreed. Several months ago, he conceded. At least, she said. He opened his eyes and looked at her with that slight, genuine smile she had been collecting since September, each one of them having become quietly precious to her. The political situation will require management, he said. It will, she agreed. My mother will want a formal discussion. I am not afraid of your mother, Marina said. I have already stood in her court and argued blood law at her. The formal discussion will be fine. She is formidable, he said. So am I, Marina said. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was so thoroughly in agreement it was almost fond. Yes, he said simply, you are. The formal discussion with the sovereign occurred the following week in a smaller chamber than the court floor, around a table that had the worn quality of great age despite its preserved beauty. Marina Corvinus sat across from Marina and Gideon and was direct in the way that Marina had come to recognize as the family characteristic. The concern was not the connection itself. The sovereign made this clear. The concern was structural. Marina was mortal, and while the vampire world had ways of addressing the question of mortality in long-term partnerships, each option carried its own weight and its own set of considerations, and these were not choices to be made lightly or quickly, or under the pressure of new feeling. Marina listened to this with full attention, because it was the kind of conversation that deserved full attention. She asked questions, the same way she asked questions in any situation where there was information she needed to understand fully. She asked about the options, the implications, the timelines, the irreversibilities. She asked about the nature of the veil, what existed beyond it, whether the exile originally sentenced for Gideon was truly a death sentence, which helped her understand the stakes of the original case. She asked about how mortal partners of vampire court members had historically navigated their lives. The sovereign answered her questions with, Marina sensed, a growing appreciation for their quality. At the end of the conversation, the sovereign said, not to Gideon, but to Marina directly, you approach this with more clarity than most who have sat at this table over 9 centuries. I am a teacher, Marina said. Clarity is the job. The sovereign considered this. There are things you will encounter in this world that will test your clarity more severely than anything you have faced before. Probably, Marina said. But I tested it in your court 3 weeks ago under ancient binding with 300 vampires staring at me. I think the baseline is established. A long pause. The sovereign looked at her son. Gideon was watching Marina with an expression that was, Marina thought with quiet certainty, love made visible in every line of his face, unguarded and completely genuine. Marina Corvinus looked back at Marina and said, in the voice of someone making a decision that they have been approaching for some time, you have standing in this court, not conferred, not borrowed, earned. She said it with the weight of something formal. I will not pretend that is uncomplicated. But it is real, Marina inclined her head. Thank you. Do not thank me, the sovereign said, and there was something in her voice that was almost dry. Thank the fact that you threw a Tennyson anthology at my court's enemies. That kind of initiative is worth recognizing. Marina glanced at Gideon. He was pressing his mouth together in the specific way that indicated he was preventing an expression of genuine amusement with limited success. The Tennyson was an impulse, Marina said. The best decisions often are, the sovereign said, and closed the conversation. The winter came to Vienna the way it always comes to old cities. with a quality of age in the cold, the same cold that had settled on those stones for centuries. Marina walked through it with a new awareness of the city's layers, the human city above, and the vampire court threaded through its foundations, both of them real, both of them inhabited by people navigating the particular difficulties of being people in the world. Mortal and immortal alike, she continued teaching at Harrow Academy. She had been told she could remain for as long as she wished, and she wished to remain because the students were extraordinary, and the work was genuine, and because she was not, under any circumstances, going to allow the existence of vampire court politics to interrupt a curriculum she had spent years developing. Her students, both human and vampire, had responded to the events of the past month with a mixture of awe and the particular discretion that students at Harrow Academy were taught from their first week, and the class on truth in testimony that she designed following her binding experience became one of the most discussed in the school's history. Gideon walked her home through the Vienna streets on the evenings when the cold was clear and the lampposts made amber circles in the dark, and she had learned to read the city through his commentary on it, centuries of accumulated observation layered over current reality, the way he noted which buildings had changed and which had not, the way he pointed out details in architecture that she would never have seen without him. He was a remarkable guide to the deep history of the world, and she was a remarkable guide to the texture of the present, and between them they made a particular kind of sense that each of them had separately recognized was not an ordinary thing. In the spring, 4 months after the court session, Arkaneth Vasile requested a meeting with Marina directly, which was unusual enough that it warranted attention. He received her in a building in the first district that looked, from the street, like a private library, which is exactly what it was, except that the library was 9 floors deep beneath ground level and contained documents that predated the printing press. He offered her tea, which she accepted, and sat across from her with the particular calm of extreme antiquity, and said, "I want to discuss something with you that is not yet discussed in the court, because it requires the input of the person most affected." She set down her cup. "I am listening." "The events of the winter established a precedent," he said, "a mortal witness, under ancient binding, with testimony that directly affected a court sentence. This has not occurred before. It will occur again. The law, as it stands, has no framework for what you demonstrated, which means that what you did exists in a grey space in blood law, recognized in practice by the Corvinus court, but not formally codified anywhere." He folded his ancient hands. "I intend to draft a formal addendum to blood law that addresses the standing of non-vampire witnesses in court proceedings. I would like your input on the draft, because you understand both the human and court perspectives in a way that is frankly singular." Marina was quiet for a moment, absorbing the scale of what he was describing. "You asking me help write vampire law," she said. "A specific addendum," he clarified. "One that would formally recognize the precedent you created. It would be a significant contribution. It would also further establish your standing in the courts in a way that is not dependent on any individual political relationship, which is a different kind of protection than the one you currently have." Marina thought about this. She thought about Gideon's note about the ancient binding, about standing in that obsidian chamber and saying 2 words that had apparently altered the way immortals thought about their own legal framework. She thought about the fact that she had always been someone who needed a challenge. I will need access to the relevant statutes, she said, and I want to review the precedent record going back at least 300 years. And if I am going to contribute to a legal document of this significance, my name goes on it formally, not as an acknowledgement but as a co-author. Arkaneth Vazil's expression shifted into something genuinely warm. Of course, he said. I expected nothing less. She told Gideon that evening, in the apartment above Harrow Academy, that had become something shared between them, her books and his layered together on shelves that had needed to be extended twice already. The Vienna evening dark and lit beyond the windows. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his gifts, and then he said, Arkaneth does not ask anyone for input unless he believes they have something no one else can provide. That is apparently me, she said. That is thoroughly and obviously you, he said. And there was a warmth in it so complete it was nearly structural, as though the warmth were load-bearing. She looked at him across the apartment, this ancient, white-haired, dangerous, tender, complicated man who had never for a moment treated her as anything other than the full equal of everything he was, and felt something settle through her so completely that it was indistinguishable from peace. This is not how I imagined my life going when I accepted a teaching position in Vienna, she said. How did you imagine it going? More straightforwardly, she said. Less vampire courts, more uncomplicated book discussions. The book discussions were never uncomplicated, he said. You argued with me about Dostoevsky for 3 hours. You were wrong about Dostoevsky. He was partially wrong about Dostoevsky, he said. You were entirely wrong about Tolstoy. I was not wrong about Tolstoy. Anna Karenina is a tragedy of systems, not of character. You maintained the opposite for. I maintained the correct position for 40 minutes, she said, and I am prepared to maintain it again, right now. He looked at her with the full, present warmth of his expression, the 2 centuries of him and the 17 human years before them, all of it directed at her with the kind of uncalculating attention that she had given up trying to take for granted, because it was the kind of thing you should never take for granted. I love you, he said. It was as direct and simple as the first time he had said it, and she thought it would always be exactly that, which was what she wanted. I love you, she said back. The addendum to Blood Law, formerly titled the Holloway Vasile Witness Doctrine, was ratified by the 3 senior courts of Europe. 14 months after the night, Marina Holloway stood in the court of Corvinus and objected. It formally established the right of any non-vampire witness, under ancient binding, to give court-recognized testimony in proceedings where they held material knowledge of the event in question. It contained a footnote in Arkaneth Vazil's drafting that read, in the formal language of blood law, this doctrine derives from a singular act of courage by a mortal witness whose standing in these proceedings was earned, not granted, and whose testimony under binding was found completely clean, establishing a precedent that the law now formally recognizes, not because mortals have been given this right, but because this one person demonstrated it had always existed. Marina read this footnote, sitting at the long library table beneath the First District building, Gideon beside her, his shoulder against hers, and she was very quiet for a long moment. That footnote is remarkable, she said. It is accurate, he said. It is generous. It is honest, he said. There is a difference. Arkaneth is precise about the difference. She read it again. She thought about standing in that chamber. She thought about the silence after she said 2 words, the way 300 centuries of accumulated authority had all briefly stopped and looked at one human woman who had decided that the blood law of immortals was not more powerful than the obligation to do what was right. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. She looked at him. He was asking something real, the way he always asked things when they mattered, directly, with his full attention, without softening the question. "No," she said, "not a single step." He covered her hand with his on the library table. His touch was cool and deliberate and entirely certain. "Neither do I," he said. "For the record." "I know," she said. The spring came back to Vienna, and they walked through it together in the evenings, the city warming around them, the deep foundations of it sheltering its ancient secrets. The life above and the life below intertwined as they had always been. Marina taught her classes and worked on a second contribution to court jurisprudence, and argued with Gideon about 19th century literature with the ferocious pleasure of two people who genuinely love ideas and each other in equal and mutually reinforcing measure. He read everything she assigned him and wrote annotations that continued to end up in her hands. Still remarkable, still sharp, the conversations on paper that preceded and extended the ones in person. The question of mortal time was not resolved by the spring. It was not a question that could be resolved quickly, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But it was a question they approached together, with the same clarity and honesty they brought to everything. And they had agreed, in the honest, direct way of two people who had established that directness was their shared language, that the decision, when it came, would be made together, with full understanding of everything it meant, and that in the meantime, the present was real and worth inhabiting completely. Marina thought this was probably the wisest position they could take. She also thought, privately, that she already knew what her answer would be when that conversation came in full. But she had learned, from the best possible teacher, that some things gained their full meaning from being said at the right moment and not before, and she was content to wait for it. In the meantime, she had a class to teach, a legal document to finish, and a vampire heir who had just argued, completely incorrectly, that Tennyson was thematically consistent across his entire body of work, which was a position she intended to dismantle with considerable enthusiasm. She walked into her classroom at Harrow Academy on a bright morning, with a stack of texts under one arm and the satisfying certainty of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what they are meant to do, in a life that had turned out to contain far more depth and strangeness and genuine love than she had thought to ask for when she first arrived in Vienna, looking for something different. The court had never allowed a mortal to object, until it had, and everything for everyone had changed. Gideon appeared in the doorway of her classroom at the end of the day as she was gathering her things, leaning against the frame with the ease of someone who has stopped pretending that this is anything other than where he intends to be, and his pale grey eyes found her across the room with that quality of attention that she suspected she would never entirely get used to, which was exactly the right amount. "Tolstoy," he said. "Absolutely not," she said. "It is a Thursday. We argue Tolstoy on Wednesdays. I thought I might make a case for extending the debate." "You always think that," she said, pulling on her coat. "And I am always right that it deserves extending." "You are occasionally right," she said, and walked toward him. And he straightened from the doorframe and held the door open for her and fell into step beside her in the hallway, their shoulders close, the familiar companionable warmth of it settling around them both as they moved through the school and out into the Vienna. Evening, the city was still and cool and gold-lit, the last of the winter finally gone, and she breathed it in and felt him beside her, present and certain, and thought that this was what it meant to have chosen something real and had it choose you back. "Tennyson," she said, after half a block. "What about him?" he said, with the tone of someone who knows exactly what is coming and is looking forward to it. "He is not thematically consistent across his body of work. You said he was. You were wrong. I said he was broadly consistent. In his treatment of mortality and time, broadly consistent is not consistent, and in memoriam directly contradicts. In memoriam is not a contradiction, it is a complication. Complications are not consistencies. In literary terms, they absolutely. Gideon. Marina, she looked up at him walking through the lamplit Vienna evening, this ancient, impossible, remarkable man who had once stood between her and a rune-blade without blinking, and who now walked beside her through ordinary streets, as though this were the most natural thing he had done in 200 years. His pale eyes were bright with the particular energy of a good argument, and underneath it was everything else, the depth of feeling that he now made no attempt to conceal, worn openly in the way he watched her, in the warmth that had no composure over it any more. That was just simply and completely real. She took his hand. He laced his fingers through hers. In memoriam, she said, is evidence that even the most consistent poet contains contradictions, which is what makes them human. A pause. Or formally human, he said quietly, and there was something in it, a recognition, gentle and unheld. Yes, she said, that too. They walked on through the city, beneath the stars that had watched over Vienna for centuries, beneath all the histories contained in those ancient stones. The mortal and the immortal threaded together in the dark, their voices carrying softly into the evening air, arguing about Tennyson, which was exactly right, which was exactly where they were meant to be.